I'm Lawrence Prelli. I'm in the Department of Communication at the University of New Hampshire.
And can you talk to us a bit about what drew you into the researching the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine?
Well, I think I came at it partially by indirection. As an undergraduate, I read some of John Campbell's papers, and I was an undergraduate at Brockport State College, and that's in the 70s. And I had a teacher there by the name of Floyd Anderson, who also was interested in rhetoric of science at the time. And he ran a graduate course, and I was unable to take that course along with him, but I did an independent reading course with him. So that exposed me to Thomas Kuhn and other sources. Then I went on to Albany State, University of, SUNY Albany, and went to Penn State. And my primary interest was in the history of rhetorical theory, which was really big at that time. In particular, how transformations in thought about communication had consequences for theory of invention. So ultimately, through those studies, I thought that theory of invention was one of the sources of perspective that were unavailable in other areas of science studies. So when I was at Penn State, I was in the interdisciplinary program, so I studied a lot of philosophy and social thought. And it always seemed to me that the perspective afforded by invention was often missing from the theorizing in those other areas. So I put it all together in my dissertation.
And what can you tell me about the history of ARST and your involvement with it?
Well, I'm never was really much involved with it, frankly. I kept an eye on what was going on. I didn't participate in the formation of that group. I may have spoken at a few panels sponsored by that group, but I can't claim any direct participation in it.
So it is the 20-year anniversary of ARST, which brings us all together. And looking back on the 20 years of this field as it's congealed, what significant tensions or intellectual sticking points sort of stand out for you even now?
Well, I think it's changed over time. In some respects, I think the rhetorical studies of science and technology was confronting a very similar problem in academics as rhetorical studies more generally. When I published my first book in 1989, seems that long ago, 1989, book publishing was relatively rare in the field of speech communication, which is where I was. And it's really the generation of rhetoricians who came of age in the 80s and the 90s who started to do book publishing. Now that's a big source of establishing, I think, the integrity of the field as a field of academics. So I think that's kind of shared in rhetorical studies more generally. Now, when I think of rhetoric of science particularly, at the outset, one of the big tensions concerned the range of rhetoric, and there was, I think, considerable skepticism in some quarters about taking an area of inquiry that tends to focus on public discourses of politics and law and then extending them to more technical discourses and the discourses of knowledge communities. And so that was a sticking point. Another layer of this, I would think, is that now I think that sticking point's gone for the most part. You could tell me as much as I could tell you, but I don't see that issue coming up any longer. The issue of whether we're extending the range beyond what we should be doing. Another dimension that I think is always going to be a struggle, but I think it's also a struggle for other fields of science studies, and that is to acquire the level of expertise in the substantive area that you're examining. At the very start of the field, there were not many case studies, and that's a lot of the work was kind of theoretical. And it's through the development of case studies and immersion in particular sciences that I think the field has acquired greater strength. So, but that is an ongoing issue, I think. You know, we can almost all rhetoricians worth their salt could do political analysis, but when you start getting into the more technical issues of a particular scientific field, you need to bone up substantially on that and acquire a level of expertise so that you can speak meaningfully about it.
So that does seem to be a persistent challenge that will face ARST and rhetoricians of science in the next 20 years.
I think so. Yeah, and how that plays out, I'm not sure. I know I felt it keenly enough myself to actually go back when I was in my 40s and acquire a master's degree in natural resources to sort of make a transition to my next portion of my scholarly program. That was very science intensive. That said, I have to say that going back after that experience, I think that the work that was done at a more theoretical level with selected cases here and there certainly was not wrong. You know, when I think of my own work, I may have sharpened some details here and there, but I think it held up even after I underwent that experience, that graduate level training experience.
One of the other challenges that I think you were amongst a group of people talking about yesterday was sort of the institutional politics and the changing university.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about how you see that as a challenge for rhetoric of science going forward?
Well, I think that this might be something, you know, a challenge that we're not alone facing, but we may feel more keenly. There was a lot of excitement about the possibilities of restructuring of the university in a way that doesn't feature academic departments and focuses on programs, programmatic or problem-solving programs. And the one issue for us as a discipline is remembering what we're about. And there's a lot of work that we can learn from, I think, in environmental communication and rhetoric, where they are participating in projects and getting funding from federal, well, they're getting federal dollars. I've reviewed a number of them for the National Science Foundation, and so they're trying to do the grants, which speaks to the times. But I think we always have to remember who we are and what does a rhetorical perspective give distinctively that other perspectives don't. I think that learning ethnography is fine, and surely learning statistics is fine, and we should do those things to better understand how to come at the phenomena that we're interested in examining. But we have to be aware that ethnographers can do that without us, and if we want to really participate meaningfully in cross-disciplinary programs and projects, we have to be clear about the distinctive perspective that we offer as a discipline.
And you mentioned one of the things that does make us distinctive, which is invention,
Mm-hmm.
focus on invention. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's, I'm being too bold to say that locating invention is sort of the core of what Rhetoric of Science brings to the
Mm-hmm.
study of science is your biggest contribution to the field, given your first book-length treatment of the subject. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Could you make the case for invention as the core of what Rhetoric of Science brings? Maybe give a couple of examples.
Well, sure. I think, you know, coming at it from my historical background, when you look at transformations in communication theory over time, I'm not the first one to say this, obviously, but when rhetorical invention is set aside, typically it's set aside in service to some other method, whether it's logic in the case of Peter Ramus, or biblical hermeneutics in the case of Augustine, and even in some of the rhetorics of the 18th century, where rhetoric became kind of predominantly stylistic alone, without much attention to invention. It seems to me restoring the prominence of invention at one stroke restores our field. So there was a lot of discussions about being handmaidens or logographers, public relations people. All of those consequences would be tied to a perception of what we do is not involving invention, and seeing us as handmaidens, as those that can help others maybe express themselves better, but not a source of insight and generation creatively of ideas. What was the other part of your question? I'm sorry.
So how does it play out in science? How does invention play out in science?
Well, I think it plays out in the sense that all discourse is generated through selection, situated selection. If we could be compelled to just do things in one way, there'd be no room for rhetorical studies. But the fact is, in human experience generally, when we're confronting questions and problems, we have to make choices. And those choices have consequences for what we say and what we do. That applies in any field of discourse, including technical fields. So once we start looking at situated choice making, we can start examining the creative processes involved in making those choices. We can scrutinize the consequences of those choices in terms of what meanings get foregrounded and what alternative meanings get concealed. That's the heart, that's the very soul of what we do. And I think that's the distinctive perspective. And there's an awful lot we can do with that. I talk about argument predominantly in a rhetoric of science, but invention, of course, is not just the invention of arguments, although that's certainly a part of it, where when you look at the invention of arguments, often what you're doing is you're selecting lines of thought that are fairly received in a community and using those to try to warrant potentially more disputable claims about issues. But we can take a step back from that and ask ourselves where those warrants initially came from to begin with. And when we're doing that, we're probing the imaginative sources of the very perspectives themselves. And I think that's a real important area for study today, to really start disclosing those primary acts of invention that have generated lines of thought and patterns of judgment that we take for granted often today in a particular field of discourse. So if you look at the topics in a rhetoric of science, they're pretty straightforward. You might want to quarrel with this or that portrayal of them, but as a list, they do kind of capture at a general level the themes and patterns of thought that are involved in making and judging claims as science. So another question then becomes, well, where do they come from? How were those generated? And as well as looking at sciences more particularly rather than as across the board, more generally at the level I worked at in that book. And I can elaborate on that later on when we get to I think you have another question about current research or.
Okay, yeah, coming up here. But if you don't mind me asking a couple other invention-related questions, I think well, my suspicion is that scientists want to say they're not doing invention, they're doing discovery. How would you respond to a scientist who made that claim? He said that, no, this is all demonstration, we're not in the realm of probability and invention and argument. It is just discovery. I've discovered something true about the universe.
Yeah, that would be a very strange scientist to say. I mean, scientists that I've talked with, I did a case study of the Gulf of Maine fisheries dispute. And the people that were trying to come up with hard and fast claims, true, false claims, were the lawyers, not the scientists. The scientists, at least when they talk among themselves, certainly recognize that their claims are largely matters of probability and likelihood. There are very few claims that they can state with certainty, at least in my experience with that. But to deal with that directly, any discovery is going to be perspectival. There's always a point of view. And when we start talking about situated choice making, those choices are going to evoke a point of view that necessarily is partial, even if it seems to have greater fidelity to experience. So I don't know if I can convince scientists who hold that line that this is the case. I can try, but it is the case. And to act as though you're doing something without perspective, without any kind of preconceptions, I would think that's even unscientific to think that way.
The shadow that lurks behind a lot of ARST conference interviews that we've been doing here goes by the name of Gankar. And it seems to me that invention is at the core of any credible response to Gankar. Gankar's critique in the Globalization Thesis. Could you say a little bit about that?
Well, I think invention, I disagreed with his critique, and I said as much in the Southern Communication Journal article. I don't think that the field was at all stalled. In fact, it was just starting. And it was starting to hit its own. So, I mean, theory of invention, I mean, which part of the critique do I look at? It was kind of a shotgun blast of multiple critiques. But when it comes to the study of invention in relation to perspective, I think I stand by what I said initially, where Burke makes quite clear how language is going to mediate what we see about a problem. And it's quite clear to me that theory of invention is not something that is inconsistent with that point of view. In fact, I think it's quite consistent. Burke thought so. I think the game is won or lost based on the theory of invention and ultimately what we can do with it.
So can you talk a little bit about some of your current work? You've been at the vanguard of the visual turn in rhetorical studies in terms of the edited volume Rhetorics of Display, and you led the discussion group or anchored the discussion group on sort of visual rhetorics of science. So could you talk about the sort of visual turn in the rhetoric of science? And it may still be a turn yet to be made.
Yeah, I'm not sure the turn is made, and I did that. I worked with Celeste Condit on that in that group, and essentially, this emphasis on invention is important here as well when I talk about rhetorical displays. That it's not only verbally that we can enact a point of view, but we can do so visually. And that's where rhetorics of display come into play. And when we think about that, there are different dimensions we can point at. Not only the complexities of graphical displays are worth considering, and of course we outlined a number of those, the use of visual displays in science, whether they're digital or analog or whatever the technology being put into play is in that case. But we can also broaden it. When we think about display includes the visual, but it also includes how we arrange space. And we talked a bit yesterday about science museums and the arrangement of artifactual displays and how those arrangements can be conducive to particular attitudes being evoked by those who become audience to them. We can look at the dimension of performance, which there's been nothing that I know of, I may just not know of it, but the actual performance of science. For example, the relatively recent conflict or controversy over ClimateGate, what became known as ClimateGate. Here you may have had a set of circumstances where people are trying to make inventional decisions about how best to display data so that they can use those data in a performance before their colleagues at a conference. Now, microsociologists have been looking at this dimension of science communication. There's one former colleague of mine, Sally Jacoby, worked, I wish I could remember the woman's name. But anyway, looking at how physicists use view graphs. And if you look at how they do it, they flip these things on there rapidly. And if you don't know what they're doing, you can't possibly follow. And not only do they do that, they have rehearsal sessions prior to the conference where they enact this performance. I mean, that's a very different dimension. When I started in natural resources, for example, I was stunned. I thought that they just made a slipshod use of visual aids. They'd throw things on there and pull them out. Even my fellow students were thinking, what's going on here? You can't really follow it. But that's all part of an act. That's all part of a performance. And that's another dimension that we can consider under the heading of displays. So although it is visual, it's also performative, it's also material and structural when we look at displays. So all of that, I think, sets out some themes that we could spend a lot of time developing and extending.
Do you have other current research you'd like to talk about?
Well, I am interested in the imaginative origins of perspectives, and in particular, I'm looking at starting off with the establishment of ecology as a science, and at this point, I've looked at in the early decades of the 20th century how tropes, the master tropes of Kenneth Burke and Hayden White, how they were sources of invention that prefigured different perspectives in biology as it was, in ecology as it was emerging as a science. And in the early days, they seem to correspond quite well with the four tropes. You actually had four different positions in contact, trying to elaborate the basic terms of the field. And as I look to the future, I know that everything is now, I'm up to the ecosystem idea, and when that was first generated. And that, of course, had considerable power and influence and dominance in the field. But even after the emergence of the ecosystem perspective, although other choices were left behind, you can see other approaches to ecology that you would call not synecdochic, as you could call ecosystem science, but metonymic. There can be a metonymic ecology even to this day that is informed by a different trope. So at this fundamental level, you're able to sort out these different points of view. Where going in, we might think that there's a kind of single monolithic way of thinking about how to do science in the context of ecology. Of course, you don't want to stop with the tropes, because ultimately what you're going to find, I think, is that many of the themes and topics that get called upon as matter of fact today emerge from these fundamental distinctions. So you can have at the source of a science the fundamental invention of the perspective. Then as that perspective develops, these themes become more practical and useful and more widely used. They become kind of like the standard topics for arguments, right? And then eventually you may find some of them fading into mere commonplaces that have lost their luster and influence to the point of being almost cliches, and we see that as well. So tracking that out is the project that I'm really interested in doing, and I'm doing that with considerable help from Kenneth Burke, who had a very strong interest in ecology, and he provides a good set of concepts with which to at least start. So I've toyed with calling this sort of poetic invention, but that really sort of takes it away from what we're doing. So for lack of a better expression, I just called it figurative invention. I'll probably change that too when this really starts unfolding and developing. So that will occupy a lot of my time, and in fact, I'm hoping that project will also have a cross current for studies of Burke, and Burke's dramatism, particularly in his early decades of work, how that can be revivified in ways that we can put it into critical usage today, in ways that engage issues that are very salient today. For one example, you can see how discourses often become closed around a particular perspective and its terminology. I went to a panel today, and it struck me about how they're using the language of evolutionary biology, and these are critical thinking types. Mutations, for example, finding mutations. The use of jokes as a way of breaking open a closed universe of discourse by challenging the normative. That's something that fits very neatly with Burke's notion of perspective by incongruity, and the reason for perspective by incongruity is to generate a dialectic where previously there was none. Closer to the ecology stuff is the discussion of sustainability, which is one of those multivalence terms that people seem to define variously. But in practice, it often seems to do service to budgeters and profiteers and corporations. You know, it wasn't initially thought of that way, but here you see a consequence that probably has some lineage to ecological thought, and we see how it has become more impoverished or co-opted more precisely by the very forces that ecological thought sought to at least question.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I mean, you've done this a bit already, but some other future directions, you know, for the next 20 years, the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine. What are the exigencies you see, or particular topics that merit investigation, or perhaps new methods that might help us in that regard?
Well, I've certainly given a lot of academic stuff, you know, the lines of academic inquiry already. I think there's a great deal of work to be done in graphics and visualization, as well as the arrangement of place and performance. But I think we should never lose sight of invention, because all of those are informed by invention ultimately, much as in the traditional view of rhetoric, all the problems of oratory and how we solve them, invention, disposition, style, and delivery, they were all integrated together in the actual act. So you can sort of pull out each one, but each one is informed by invention. And I stress that point because it seems to me that as people go out with great enthusiasm to try to participate in cross-disciplinary projects, and we need to keep clarity on what it is that we do distinctively. And we offer a distinctive perspective. And that perspective can be developed premised on what we know about invention, how we think about invention. So that to my mind is an important thing to keep in mind. I do worry about the fate of the university with all this enthusiasm, and the fate of academic traditions as a consequence, where we can get so caught up in cross-disciplinary projects that are problem-focused. If that starts winning, it becomes possible to lose sight of where you come from. And that's what academic departments have done. They've maintained those intellectual traditions. So I think that is a challenge, but that's a challenge confronting the university as a whole. But specifically for us, because it is good to try to get involved in science projects, you know, I'm not opposed to that. But when we do so, I think it's important that we play to our strengths and show what we do distinctively. Because if we don't, we will end up being handmaidens in these projects, or they'll say, well, you can design a course, you know, teaching students about my research project, you know, that sort of thing. I've encountered that, I've experienced that, and clearly that isn't what we want to do. But it's a very modest contribution, I think, when we think about this. It involves doing detailed case studies of how people talk about science issues in particular communities. For example, I had mentioned the Gulf of Maine case. That's much under discussion at the University of New Hampshire. Going into those communities and getting some clarity about how they generate their perspectives and what their perspectives are, and distinguishing those perspectives, trying to figure out the consequences of the points of view that they take. That is a very distinctive rhetorical, a contribution of rhetorical analysis. No one else does that.
So our parting question has been, what advice would you give to young people in the field, either graduate students or maybe people who are just starting out? What served you well What's some advice that you took to heart or that you learned through trial and error or on the job?
Well, I think one thing to keep in mind is to look about where you are. And regardless of where you are, which university you're at, I think it's very valuable to try to get to know people across the campus who are doing science and it can be in a very applied context. Try to get involved with, I don't know if your universities have this, an extension service where they go out into the field and work with the public. See if you can tag along or meet those people. Try to get to know, if you're developing a science project, try to get to know people who are working in that area and try to get up to speed on it. I think it's really important to make those kinds of contacts in grounding your work in rhetoric of science, or the other, even more so, I imagine, medicine and technology.